Hello, everybody. This is Phil Gorski from the Critical Realism Network, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our latest webinar on critical realism, sociology, and history. Our speaker for today will be Professor George Steinmetz from the Sociology Department at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. I know that some of you have already joined us for a couple of our past webinars. If you missed those, I'd encourage you to go take a look at our website, criticalrealismnetwork.org, and you will be able to listen to full podcasts of those past webinars and also to take a look at the PowerPoint presentations that went along with them. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just one very quick technical note, which is that if you would like to ask a question, the way to do that is to click on the switch in the upper left hand of your screen that says Ask a Question. If you want to chat with other participants, you're certainly welcome to use the chat box, but I would not necessarily encourage that. I'd rather encourage you to ask questions via the Ask a Question box, because those are the questions that we'll be looking through and passing on to George as the webinar unfolds. And I'd also just like to briefly announce that we will be soliciting applications for a couple of events connected to the project. In particular, we'll be doing another philosophy of social science and critical realism summer seminar this coming summer. The graduate student version will be the 2 weeks immediately before the ASA meetings in Seattle, and those will take place. That seminar will take place in Tacoma. And we're still working on the final dates for the postdoctoral version, but that is likely to be in late June. So enough announcements. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over now to Professor Steinmetz, who will give us a brief presentation first, and then after concluding that, we'll be responding to questions. So I'll turn it over to you, George.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So I wanted to give something today that's a little bit, has some introductory material as well as some more detailed stuff, because I know some of the people participating haven't necessarily been to the workshops yet. So I'll start, and you'll see that it kind of goes back and forth. Critical realism, I've been arguing for a long time, is pretty useful for historical sociologists. Critical realism, in 1998, I said it's even liberating for us because it provides a pretty powerful rebuttal to views of social science that prioritize the ideas of empirical invariance, of causal laws, of prediction, of parsimonious explanation. And critical realism guards against any slide into pure empiricism. Now, that should not be confused with empirical research. Empiricism is something different, by showing why theoretical mechanisms need to be central to all kinds of explanation, including historical ones. At the same time, critical realism suggests that contingent conjunctural causality is actually the norm in open systems like society and not an unusual condition. Therefore, parsimonious explanation is rarely possible. Yet critical realism's epistemological relativism leads it to accept the results of a lot of the recent history and sociology of science in a very relaxed and easygoing way, without giving into what Bhaskar and critical realists call judgmental relativism. In other words, an anything-goes perspective on choosing science, choosing models of science or explanatory theories or that kind of thing. Historical social researchers are reassured by critical realism of the acceptability of their already existing scientific practice, often, even if it doesn't match what sometimes we could refer to as mainstream social science misconstrues as the scientific method. Critical realism, therefore, kind of affirms the value of existing social research. One might ask then, why should a historian or a historical sociologist even bother reading this if what they're doing already conforms to a good philosophy of science anyhow? One answer to this is that philosophical assumptions help to govern the focus of attention in the social sciences and practices of social scientists, whether they know it or not. And social scientists, as well as historians, are bombarded by different philosophies of science throughout their entire education and career. While some of these philosophical assumptions are stated explicitly, they're also often expressed more spontaneously as emanations of a kind of a scientific epistemological unconscious, or else they develop in an indirect and informal fashion. This informal approach to social science epistemology is also perhaps even more typical of historians than sociologists, which underscores Charles Tilly's membership in both of those camps. Philosophical statements crop up everywhere, from introductory courses in theory, methods, and statistics, to the comments made by teachers and even reviewers of your written work, and to the ongoing daily, even spontaneous responses, even tweets nowadays by different sociologists, to examples of that they encounter of sociological practice and texts. We can study these almost habitual practices, I think, alongside the more explicitly articulated philosophical proposals as part of the ongoing struggles over epistemology within any disciplinary field. And indeed, I think the historical sociology of sociology itself is just as crucial for self-reflexivity as is the philosophy of social science, which is something we've been more focused on in the current network. Could we go to the next slide, please? Critical realism can provide a kind of a framework for sorting out these arguments and an immunization against misleading philosophies of science. And here I've put up a quote from Phil Gorski's own analogy, which I really like, between the philosophy and practice of science and the relations between theories of hydrodynamics and swimming. I think this is really illuminating, and as Phil writes, an erroneous theory of hydrodynamics could make it harder to learn swimming. Imagine if the most influential school of swimming instructors continually advise their charters to just get as big as possible when they're going through the water. Or I like his other example, a third school contends that water resistance is just a mere projection of the human mind. A few naturally talented people, he continues, might still become very good swimmers by dint of good instincts and simply a lot of practice, and they might even pass this practical knowledge on to younger swimmers, bypassing the official instructors. But they would do so in spite of the instructors, not because of them, and on a practical level, they would have a lot to unlearn. I think this example is really quite analogous to the situation that many historical sociologists face in contemporary sociology. Accurate knowledge of the ontology of the social world is pretty useful in helping us know which pieces of advice we should take seriously and which of them we should disregard and which of them we should actively try to unlearn. In the rest of my lecture, I want to talk about three topics. First, I want to reconstruct the history of historical sociology itself. And here, the founding generations of historical sociologists, which I place in Germany between 1900 and 1933, I think were engaged in a very explicit philosophical battle that pitted historicism, as it was called, against positivism. That was also the label used at the time. A historically accurate genealogy of historical sociology, I think, is instructive for several reasons. One is that it reveals the ways history has been treated in battles over methods and epistemology in the social sciences for quite some time. Most existing accounts of historical sociology in the United States tend to ignore this early formation for reasons that I'll try to suggest a little later. I would argue that the historicist pole in the pre-1933 configuration was compatible in many respects, although not all of them, with critical realism. In the second part of my talk, I'll sketch out some of the basic contours of the epistemological unconscious, as I have tried to call it, in contemporary U.S. sociology. I've sometimes referred to this as methodological positivism, and I'll contrast three basic assumptions of that formation with critical realist understandings and suggest how a historical approach in social science corresponds better to critical realism. And in the final part of my talk, I'll turn to comparison. Although this topic is philosophically somewhat separate from the theme of historical sociology, it has become inseparable from it, at least in the United States, since the 1980s. The relevant section of the American Sociological Association, after all, is called the Comparative and Historical Sociology section, often abbreviated even as CHS. Note here that the adjective comparison even comes before historical. I'll argue that comparison is not essential for all historical work, but it plays indeed an essential role in the justification of theories. Okay, so turning to part one, and I've already got the slide up here, the origins of historical sociology, I'd like to start by trying to define this object. Although there were some sociologists who claimed to be doing historical work before 1900, the real start, the first original wave, if you want to use that language of historical sociology, arose in Germany between around 1900 and 1933. Before that time, the only thing resembling historical sociology were universal evolutionary models of social change. The plausibility of these models was pretty much demolished, at least in Europe, by the carnage of World War I and by the generalized crisis of European society after 1918. In addition to this contextual evidence against evolutionism, there was one key set of intellectual preconditions that made it possible for these German sociologists to move in a historical direction. Key here were the century-long movements of Romanticism and Historicism, and they insisted on the singularity of human culture, practices, and events, and rejected universal laws of human social evolution. Although these two movements, Romanticism and Historicism, existed everywhere in Europe in the first half of the 19th century, they really only survived and became quite powerful over the human sciences in Germany before 1914. The distinction between the methods that were applicable to the so-called cultural sciences and those of the natural sciences did not then originate suddenly with Windelband and Dilthey, but went back to a line of thought with its origins in the revolt of the German historical school against the traditions of natural law. Academic sociology emerged within the German universities in the early 20th century in the division of the Geisteswissenschaften, or the humanities, and only in the new universities that were created after 1918, for example in Frankfurt am Main, was there a distinct social science division. This is the context then in which Max Weber emerged, and he's shown here on the slide as the key inspiration for a truly interpretive historical sociology. Weber had studied Roman history for his habilitation thesis, and after 1900 he engaged seriously with the philosophy of Heinrich Rickert, also shown here. Rickert belonged to the Southwest German school of Neo-Kantianism. He agreed with another older member of that school, Windelband, that the human and the natural sciences were fundamentally different. Windelband had distinguished sharply between what he called the nomothetic, or general law-seeking, and the ideographic forms of knowledge. The human sciences, all of these philosophers agreed, were inherently cultural and hermeneutic. This included sociology, along with economics, anthropology, and history. For Windelband, the ideographic was something that was beyond explanation. Our only access to these objects was hermeneutic, or interpretive. Rickert partly agreed with this. He argued that the objects studied by the human sciences were historical individuals, in his term, unique singular events, institutions, communities, or humans. But Rickert disagreed with Windelband and Dilthey insofar as singular events could also be explained, he argued, and Weber picked this up and agreed with this. American sociologists often acknowledge Weber's attempt to combine explanation and interpretation. They reference Weber's argument for combining generalizing and individualizing concepts. But what's been largely overlooked in the reception of Weber in the US, I think, is this central focus at the time on this idea of historical individuals. The Rickert-Weber solution, I think, is partly compatible with critical realism. I think it's also an important piece of evidence about the kind of elective affinities between historical sociology and historicist, non-positivist philosophies of science. But the particular manner in which critical realism understands the ontology of the social and the epistemology of social science renders the Rickert-Weber synthesis more compelling. Maybe we could go to the next slide here. There are also two key differences between critical realism and Weber's version of historicism, and that Weberian version is the most influential version today in sociology, arguably. If Weber had simply stopped with the idea of the historical individual as being amenable to both explanation and interpretation, he would already be compatible with CR. But there are two other aspects of his epistemology that are less compatible. One of these is the idea, of course, of value-free science. I won't say anything about this today, but refer you to the work of Chris Smith, Phil Gorski, Ruth Groff, Doug Porpora, Andrew Sayer, and others. Critical realism rejects this idea of a sharp division between science and values. The other key difference between Weber and critical realism is the ideal type as a model of concept formation. I propose a critical realism alternative to ideal types, which I call real types. But before getting into that anymore, let me continue tracing the emergence of this foundational wave of historical sociology. It was Max Weber's brother, Alfred, who first used the phrase historical sociology, or more precisely, history sociology, Geschichtssoziologie in German, and I think this was a key naming act. There were American sociologists who had already used the phrase historical sociology before that, but they emphasized evolutionary and Darwinian approaches. Weimar history sociology was something different, and maybe we could go to the next slide. This was the first genuinely historical approach in academic sociology. It was the first form that integrated practicing historians, and several dozen historically oriented sociologists studied with Weber, Alfred Weber, at his Heidelberg University Institute during the Weimar Republic, including two of the most important ones to even today, Norbert Elias and Karl Mannheim. Historicism or neo-historicism became so compelling for the Weimar era sociologists that by 1932, Mannheim was able to declare to the other German teachers of sociology at a big meeting they all had that the historical individualizing approach, as he called it, was the crowning approach in the discipline, quote, organizing like an invisible hand the work of the cultural sciences, including sociology. The work of these historicist historical sociologists was brutally interrupted by the rise of Nazism. Most of them went into exile, mainly to the United States, and there they encountered a sociology discipline that was uninterested or even actively hostile to their historical sensibilities. Weimar historicist sociology was scattered into different disciplines and into some more marginal parts of American sociology. The two stars of Weimar historical sociology, Mannheim and Elias, encountered similar resistance in their British exile. Within Germany, Hitler helped the presentist positivists in sociology to attain a position of dominance during the Nazi era, and they remained dominant after the war. Alfred Weber resurfaced at Heidelberg after 1945, but was marginalized in sociology thanks to the support lent by collaborating sociologists and by Americans and U.S. military occupation authorities. The sociology that emerged then after 1945 in West Germany bore little resemblance to this historicist formation before 1933. When historical sociology finally reemerged in the 1970s in the US, this had almost no connections to the earlier German formation. There were a few alternatives, though, and a few alternative philosophical frameworks that could provide historical sociologists with arguments against the kind of neo-positivism dominant at the time. One of them that was chosen by most of the historical sociologists, as Adams, Orloff, and Clemens have argued in Remaking Modernity, was Marxism. But the problem is that Marxism and neo-Marxism did not have a single position on the key questions of historical epistemology that concern us here. Marxism was divided between universalizing evolutionary approaches and philosophies closer to the neo-historicism described earlier. Another possibility for people coming out in the 1970s and 80s in historical sociology was the French historical school that had been so influential for Pierre Bourdieu. But for reasons too detailed to go into today, the reception of that philosophical orientation of Bourdieu's into the English-speaking world didn't occur until very recently. A third possibility was the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar, and so here we finally come to Bhaskar. And when I myself came up in the 1980s as a historical sociologist, I first turned to Bhaskar in order to defend the kind of work that I was already doing in graduate school. Since I was lucky enough to be taught by historians as well as sociologists, and had associated myself with the historicist branch of the Charles Tilly School of Historical Sociology, my work didn't really follow the pseudo-experimentalist design that was being defended at the same time within comparative historical sociology, nor did I really embrace what at the time was known in broader social science discussions as the comparative method, which treated the names of places and periods as variables and looked for constant conjunctions of events. Although Bhaskar was not being read by historians, nor by historical sociologists at the time, he did seem to provide the philosophical tools for a defense of the historical case study as both explanatory and as therefore being scientific, and critical realism made sense of the actual practice of most historians and historical social scientists. So now I want to turn to part 2 on critical realism and historical sociology, and let me backtrack for a moment and summarize what I mean by sociological positivism so that the differences from critical realism become clear. A somewhat watered-down version of positivism is still widespread in American social science, and this mainstream social science positivism, I think, is primarily defined by some sort of a search for Humean-style constant conjunctions of events, that is, by an ontological belief in what Roy Bhaskar called regularity determinism. This is the core of contemporary sociological positivism. Critical realism provides a pretty powerful rebuttal to this doctrine of universal covering laws. I assume this is pretty familiar to most of the people listening today, but let me just say that critical realism, as I understand it, argues that the social is an open system inhabited by a rainforest-like profusion of causal powers, to use Andrew Collier's phrase, which interact in both patterned and in contingent accidental ways. In open systems, unlike in the artificial closure of the experimental situation, causal mechanisms combine, producing events conjuncturally, that is to say, in concert with other mechanisms. This means that complexity and nuance, as opposed to parsimony or causal reductionism, is better suited to realistically describing the actual determination of social events in most cases. I guess we could go to slide 6 now. Conjunctural and contingency-based explanations are the most appropriate ones for capturing the ontological specificity of social reality. Conjunctural in this context means overdetermined. Complex events are codetermined or overdetermined by constellations of mechanisms. The word contingency in this context implies that these constellations are not repeatable in a general way in many cases, and that the components that make up the causally effective constellation of causes may vary across events or instances of a given event. Generative mechanisms or structures have to be studied in the wild, as it were, and to complicate matters even further, they often appear in impure forms, mixed up with other causal powers or mechanisms, and this is indicated by case 2 in the diagram here from Bhaskar, in which 3 causal mechanisms are shown as combining in a nexus, M1, 2, and 3, along with a 4th lone wolf kind of causal mechanism coming in from the left in producing an event. Current positivism in sociology, to move back to my topic, has 3 other main features, again, which can be contrasted with critical realism in useful ways, shedding light on the way historical sociology should and often is conducted. First, positivism, as defined primarily by regularity determinism here, is often combined with actualism, also referred to as empiricism. And this is an ontological stance denying the existence of underlying structures, entities, or powers, or denying any access to them. It locates the succession of cause and effect entirely at the surface of these events. There are some regularity determinists, however, who admit the existence of underlying unobservable or theoretical structures and allow them to determine empirical events. Rational choice theory sometimes takes the form of a depth realist positivism, and some rational choice theorists reject regularity determinism. Actualism is thus a widespread, but I don't think a necessarily defining feature of current sociological positivism. It's opposed by ideas of ontological stratification and emergence in critical realism. I won't go through emergence since we've heard Phil Gorski's lecture on that topic already, but let's just say that critical realism is opposed to the forms of reductionism that assert the unreality of these causal strata. This leads to a radically different understanding of the meaning of causal laws in critical realism. Within critical realism, a law is not a constant conjunction of events, but it's the characteristic pattern of activity or tendency of a mechanism. I think we could go to slide 7 now. More specifically, real structures, possess causal powers which, when triggered or released, act with natural necessity and universality as generative mechanisms. Social theory is then concerned with these underlying causal powers. This is where I think a distinction between Weberian ideal types and what I would call real types comes in. Weber's methodological solution, the ideal type, I think differs from the critical realist position insofar as the latter does not seek first to resolve a complex event into its components through abstraction, the Weberian approach proceeding from there via the process of retroduction to descriptions of relations between these events and some underlying postulated causal powers. Instead, the ideal type, as I understand it, resolves a complex event in a different way. It willfully accentuates certain aspects of the event rather than seeking to identify the event's essential characteristics or determinants, and it does not assume the ontological layering emergence that necessitates a move from the event level to the mechanism level. The actualist or empiricist is unconcerned with the powers or tendencies of underlying causal mechanisms, but only with the correlations of empirical indicators. But social theory in critical realism is not a mere redescription of empirical regularities. Social science, including historical social science, combines theory and explanation. So now I've talked about regularity, determinism, and actualism, and I want to turn to another feature of positivism, which I think distinguishes it from critical realist understandings of social science and therefore historical social science, which is the difference between a critical naturalism and a plain old naturalism. In other words, an equation of the social sciences with the natural sciences. Critical realism argues the differences between the natural and the social sciences are rooted in real ontological differences between the objects that they study. And there are four key sorts of differences. All four of these are congruent with specifically historical sociology, as I've defined it already, and as I think the Weimar historicists already described it. The most distinctive of these ontological differences is one that was at the core of German historicism and other historicisms. This is the idea of the concept dependency, to use Bhaskar's terms, of the causal powers, and the events in social science. Unlike natural structures, social structures do not exist independently of the agent's conceptions of what they're doing. More precisely, social structures don't play a causal role independently of people's attributions of meaning to them. It may be true that the meanings change, for example. When we perceive or reuse the ruins of a lost civilization, it may also be the case that the material artifacts of a prior culture have certain kinds of affordances, to use the term central to Webb Keene's new book, Ethical Life, and not others, regardless of the meanings that went into producing them. But what affordances means in this context is that there will be certain limits placed on meanings that can be attached to an object. It doesn't determine exactly what those meanings will be. Even here, the causal role of these artifacts at any given moment is consubstantial with the meanings that we attach to them. All of this means that an interpretive dimension is intrinsic to social research. Concept dependency also provides another nail in the coffin of the Humean constant conjunctions model, because human beings are able to learn from their own practices and from the social structure, and to learn about the social structures in which they're active, and may therefore try to change these deliberately. Social science itself leads to changes in the behavior of the people it studies, and a historical approach is essential then for studying these kinds of dialectical movements between structure and agency, and here we can go to the next slide. Bhaskar already suggested this in his very earliest work using the model that he called the transformational model of social activity. A second key difference between the naturalism of the naturalist naturalism and the critical naturalism is that the social and natural sciences differ in terms of the greater historical and geographical specificity of the causal powers within the social sciences as opposed to the natural ones. Again, this is relative and not absolute. A third difference is between the social and the natural sciences is that the causal powers described within the social sciences are practice dependent. That is, they don't exist independently of human action and practice. Thus, while we may speak abstractly of a space, a field, or a network of social positions, these don't exist independently of the practices that they ground. And the final difference between the social and the natural that distinguishes between critical naturalism and naturalist naturalism concerns the deep connections between ethics and social science. Again, I'm going to bracket this topic now. Let me turn to the last defining feature of sociological positivism and distinguish it from critical realism. And I think this is somewhat separate from the first two. I call this scientism. It's not my term, but I think it's applicable here. And what scientism means is that the real or imagined natural sciences are taken as guides for the methods and even the aesthetics of sociology. I've already covered some of this under the headings of constant conjunctions, actualism, and simple or naturalist naturalism. But there are other aspects of scientism. For example, scientism prefers parsimonious accounts and calls them elegant, as if what was being described here was a new car or even a spaceship. The constant conjunctions model, by contrast, does not insist that the explanatory variables should be few in number. Another example concerns quantitative methods. There's nothing inherently positivist about this at all. Statistics can make crucial contributions to describing what Tony Lawson calls demi-regularities of practice. And I've used statistics in my own work, as have other critical realists. But they have always, I think, to be combined with interpretive methods, since meaning is as inseparable from the existence of these practices, events, and artifacts as one side of a piece of paper is from the other. Quantitative data and statistics are often preferred simply because they have a veneer of science. Now, part three of my comments, I want to turn to the question of comparison. As I mentioned, the domination of methodological positivism in sociology and other social sciences in the US since World War II has meant that scientific or analytic qualitative research as such has come to be identified with comparison. In a 2002 book, Mahoney and Ruschmeyer are especially interested in distancing comparative historical analysis from what they describe as mere case studies or idiographic research. Critical realism distinguishes among the activities of comparison, explanation, and theory, and suggests that social science explanation doesn't need to involve comparison at all, even if comparison is part of this overall combined process of science. Like classic historicism, critical realism acknowledges the irreducible singularity of some historical events. Social life is understood within critical realism as an open system, as I've mentioned, in which a multiplicity of causal mechanisms or more complex structures interact in a contingent way, generating empirical events. The explanation of a unique event involves constructing a plausible model of the contingent conjuncture of causal structures that combine to generate that event. The historian or historical sociologist then engages in a retroductive analysis in order to assess the model's plausibility. Retroduction, as it's defined here, involves inference from effects to explanatory structures. It's a form of inference to the best explanation that infers by answering questions like what made X possible, where X is the event. A retroductive argument is one that necessitates the building of a model of the mechanism, which, if it were to exist and to act in the postulated way, could account or would account for the phenomenon concerned. Now, if you think of it this way, a case study is perfectly capable of explaining a single event. Nonetheless, comparison is valued, and I think it should be valued even within critical realism, and it has to be valued as a means of assessing the plausibility of inferences or theories. The ontological peculiarities of social life mean that the case study is a precondition for any comparative assessment of theory. The case study and comparison are inseparable. The plausibility of a theoretical argument can only be assessed through the study of complex, overdetermined empirical cases. Cases or events are the indispensable building block for social science. Case studies should not be relegated to the idiographic then, or construed as raw data waiting to be processed by a nomothetic theory machine. The only way to gain confidence in the plausibility of theoretical causal structures in the longer term, however, is through comparison, specifically through comparative case studies, or other forms of reasoning, such as counterfactual reasoning based on evidence. Comparative history takes two main forms, and these are arguably located at the levels of the real and the empirical. And I want to conclude my comments today with this summary of two of the articles I think that were pre-distributed to people listening in today, where I talk about these two kinds of comparison. One of these is comparison across the event level, and one of these is comparison across the level of causal powers. I suggest both of these are fruitful kinds of comparison. It's the comparison across empirical events that is usually thought of as the comparative method, however. Comparison across theoretical mechanisms, or what I sometimes have called depth realist comparison, differs from empiricist or actualist versions of comparison in that it's quite happy to juxtapose and contrast and compare events or individuals that seem to have very little in common at the empirical level. In some ways, then, this depth realist comparison violates the more historical approaches to comparison associated with the historian Marc Bloch, for example, in his book on the historical method. What unites the cases, at least hypothetically in this approach, the depth realist comparative approach, is the effectivity of some social structure or causal mechanism. The goal of explanation is to investigate the vicissitudes of this conceptual mechanism across differing concrete cases, contexts, or events. Indeed, since events are the result always of overdetermined and contingent conjunctions of causal mechanisms, in critical realism at least, they're always singular in some respects. Every event is singular. And the macro events that are the most significant historically and that are the most significant to the wider public that reads our work, hopefully, events such as the French Revolution or the Holocaust, are the least amenable to grouping into types. This is then one of the main reasons why I think we need to really think about both kinds of comparison, because these kinds of singular events have been, for reasons that are not entirely, I think, conscious to sociologists, excluded from sociological research for a long time because of their uniqueness. The second approach is the more familiar. This involves comparing cases that are empirically similar, and this is actualist comparison. Here we compare a series of events constructed as empirically commensurable with one another. The positivist comparative method, called macro-causal analysis sometimes, is really identical to actualist comparison at the level of the basic selection of cases, though not in other terms. Even where there are identifiable types of empirical objects, we can't assume that each instance is determined by the same concatenation of causes. Indeed, a research project that were constructed solely along the lines of actualist comparison and conducted with careful attention to the complex structures of causality is just as likely to transform itself into a series of parallel case studies tracing different patterns of causality as it is to find a single invariant causal configuration. So I think I'll stop there. If people would like me to give any empirical examples of this, I'd be happy to do that. But let's see what the questions are that might arise from this. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, George. Thank you very much, George. This is Phil again.
Hi, Phil.
So I think I'll actually lead off with a question for you.
Okay.
This is a topic that you and I have talked about off and on, though never at great length or in great depth. But I'd like to get you to say a little bit more about your current thinking about what a real type methodology would look like. So what would be in your mind, for example, the procedures that you would use to construct a real type, what sorts of evidence would you look for to confirm or disconfirm the operation of a particular real type. So, and just in general, any thoughts you might have about how we might go about developing this a kind of a real type methodology as an alternative to the kind of standard ideal type methodology that we got from Weber.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that the way I'm trying to think about science doesn't require that one individual accomplish all of the tasks. And obviously with retroduction and the dialectic of evidence and theory, there's a kind of a collective effort as well. And I think it's important for the real type discussion too. That said, I think it's kind of like, Phil, with your example of swimming, that you might be able to construct a real type even though you thought you were doing an ideal type, but if you're aware of the differences, you might be led somewhere differently. And the fact that the ideal type methodology often involves this idea of a willful accentuation of certain aspects of whatever it is you're studying, and also that I think it is premised on an ontology that doesn't make an explicit distinction between the levels of causal powers and the level of events, could lead you down a different path. And so it's more of an orienting, I think it's more of an orienting statement than anything else. But at the abstract level, a real type would be one that captures as well as possible the real structures either of the event or if you're constructing a real type that is supposedly about a causal power, it would be that picture or image or model that you construct to capture as well as possible what it is. Now, it's clear from Bhaskar that he explicitly rejects any correspondence theory of science, the idea that scientific models literally are mirrors of nature. We're not talking about that, but there is a dialectical process by which, hopefully through judgmental rationality, we can come closer and closer. And I think a real type orientation accepts that, and the ideal type orientation, I think, is rooted in a different philosophy of science. But I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that, Phil, too. And maybe
well, I'm not the only one who's interested in this question. I have another question that's come in asking that we focus on some concrete examples. So here's one thought that I have. I wonder, for instance, whether some of Weber's most famous ideal types might actually be reinterpreted as real types, and that it's precisely the fact that they are tacitly real types which makes them so powerful. So let me just give you one example, which would be the different forms of legitimate domination or legitimate authority, right? Charismatic, traditional, bureaucratic, something that everybody who does kind of comparative, historical, political, transnational sociology is going to be familiar with. And if you sort of drill down, what underlies those different typologies is changing relational and ideological configurations between actors and institutions or something like that, right? And that what you're really trying to get at then is the difference might be something like this, that an ideal type looks at as many possible cases of something as it can, bureaucracy, charisma, whatever, and then looks for some kind of least common denominator or, things that recur very, very frequently, and then constructs a list of those things. Whereas what a real type methodology might more explicitly do would be it would say, well, what are sort of the things that are essential to that kind of authority? In other words, if this relationship were not the way that it is, or this particular actor were not the way that they are, then it wouldn't be the kind of authority that it is. Does that make any sense? So that you're thinking more in terms of what particular entities and relations generate a particular kind of social causal power, as opposed to just looking for regularities or things that recur frequently in different contexts.
I think that's a really interesting way to start the discussion, and it points to one thing that the Weberian approach doesn't do, which is distinguish between the causal powers or mechanisms level and the events level. And presumably, if you're trying to generate a real type, you could be doing that at either level, and you could discuss the concepts that we're trying to invent in the social sciences, like the unconscious or fields or exploitation or whatever, as kind of real types as well. But to go back to your examples, I think there you see that we probably need a critical realist approach to creating empirical level typologies as well. And that's a little less obvious what that looks like, I think, possibly, unless you wanted to select out the aspects of a complex concatenated nexus of events that are more causally related to the causal mechanisms. So if we could go back to the slide that I had from Roy Bhaskar's Human Emancipation book for a moment, I can maybe make it clear what I'm trying to say. If you can go back, I think, to slide number 5 or 6, the nexus slide. Yes. So if you look at the one, I talked about case 2, but case 4 has multiple determinations of events as a nexus in an open system. So you see E is an event, but it's an event, he's trying to diagram it as a complex event instead of a simple event. And I think that's one way we could think about this is we're trying to get the essential points of that triangle, the ones that are connected to causal mechanisms. That would be another approach. A real type would be one that, instead of abstracting out and willfully selecting the aspects of E that are just arbitrarily interesting to us, we could try to motivate them a little more seriously in terms of their relationship to causal determinants that are not just our own willfully invented ones, but that have some kind of a program going on connecting to other scientists that gives them some greater plausibility through the kind of thing I was talking about at the end, through a number of different empirical cases that can then be added up and compared or used as evidence. Does that make any sense? That you've got E in case 4 and you've got M in case 2, and both of them are represented as complex nexuses, and a real type presumably would try to capture the more essential aspects of them.
So let me ask you a slightly different question here, George. So I was kind of struck by the diagram that came relatively early. This is the transformational model of social action, and we might be able to get that back up on the screen because it looks an awful lot like the Coleman boat, the micro-macro or macro-micro-macro model. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that jumped out at me in looking at it this time is that the arrows between 2 and 3 and 4 and whatever that is, T2, are exactly vertical, which they're not in the case of the Coleman boat. I mean, the Coleman boat, they're slanted, and I think this is really significant because what this model is implying is that there are kinds of causes that are simultaneous with their effects, as opposed to preceding or following. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying diagrammatically. I'm trying to think about what it might be for a causal effect to be simultaneous as opposed to a time gap between them.
Well, I think we tend. This comes back a little bit to something that we were talking about in the emergence webinar, which is, we tend to think of causation in terms of this, what I kind of derisively call the billiard ball ontology, which is causation is all occurring at one level or on one plane. It occurs in a two-dimensional space as opposed to a three-dimensional space, which is to say that it in classical terms, it's all efficient causality. Whereas with this diagram of Royce's is opening up is the possibility of something like formal causation. That is where the important effect here is the way in which, say, a new structure that's created at juncture 1 and gradually becomes instantiated, then fundamentally transforms, say, activity which is occurring at the level of practice at T3, right?
Yes.
Right, and this is a possibility that's not really there, I think, in the standard Coleman-Bode example, which suggests that what happens at the structural level is somehow affecting people by their observation of what's going on and their knowledge of what's going on, whereas, oftentimes the way in which structures operated, is at least for a time, as it were, behind people's backs without them knowing, by structuring their interactions in ways in which they might not be fully aware of.
Yeah, I think that is entirely correct. I I agree with that interpretation of the difference between the Coleman atomistic one, which is really a kind of an atomism, that the level above there is not emergent from the level below. That distinction I totally agree with. Yeah. And it is remarkable that they look so similar, but they mean something different. Yeah, this is the Bhaskar boat, if you want to.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to be a somewhat more old-fashioned boat with square sides or something like that. But the Bhaskar boat and the Coleman boat are there are some really important differences that don't immediately jump into your eyes. So,
yeah, and the verticality that you're talking about could be, if you interpret it the way you do, I think that builds it into a more important difference between the two. I like that. So and that's a kind of a weird thing to talk about in a discussion of historicism and historical, because it's about a simultaneity. And Coleman's looks superficially more historical because it has the tilting arrows, and time's arrow seems to be driving it in that way.
So I have a more skeptical question now for you, George, from one of the participants, who asked, first of all, an important part of your argument for critical realism is that it legitimates the kind of historical analysis you're already doing, particularly its constant conjunction view of causation. But that's not a reason why a skeptic might choose to adopt CR. Is there any way to use your work or that of others to demonstrate the accuracy of at least some elements of critical realism, or must it be adopted a priori?
Could you, Phil, try to elaborate on this a little? They think I'm using it just to legitimate my own work, or one possible reading would be that I've adopted a philosophy that makes it look legitimate. And are there any other cases of historians or historical work that would make sense in terms of this, or?
Well, I guess the question is whether there's some way in which, empirical historical research could, if not prove, at least corroborate some of the basic assumptions of critical realism, which, I would say are about things like how causation actually works in the social world, or that there are strong forms of structural emergence in the social world.
Well, there are very good ones, and in a way, I didn't have time to talk about those, but perhaps the most powerful one that's emerged in the last 100 years, in which unobservable causal entities that are emergent from biology have been shaping events, is the whole field of psychology, and especially psychoanalysis, in which, and we now know from even cognitive neuroscientists, that there is unconscious cognitive processes going on, so we don't even have to question that any longer. And we know that if we had a model, as we did 100 and some years ago, of unconscious processes shaping events, thoughts, symptoms, whatever, we could make sense of them in ways that we couldn't without emergence. So check that one off, I think. Emergence and the distinction of the ontological stratification for the social sciences, that seems to follow from that, although you need other examples. I would point to the entire structuralist revolution in the mid-20th century as pointing to things like social fields as objects that are not immediately observable that clearly seem to shape behaviors in ways that aren't completely predictable, but nonetheless causal. I'm sure we could come up with all sorts of others. So that, that level, the ontological stratification between the real and the event level. As for the fact that the social is an open system with multiple causal mechanisms and that they're often combining to produce outcomes, I think anyone who reads the history of any major event will be struck by the quick death of single factor explanations. Whether you're talking about trying to explain the French Revolution or the Nazi Holocaust or the collapse of the world economy more recently in 2008, any of these, although the first two are better researched now, so let's stick to those. The reductionist single factor models have collapsed, suggesting the need for more than one mechanism. And then in terms of, I don't know how many of these different distinctions we want to go through, but maybe you could ask the person whether they're skeptical about the differences between naturalist naturalism and critical naturalism, but it seems to me that that one has been fairly decisively decided upon, that you can't just study social practices and social processes as if they were thing-like without understanding the meanings that are attributed to them. The fact that causal powers emerge historically and are not as trans-historical as they're thought to be in some sciences, as I think there's some good evidence for the rise of things like we have in the social sciences, the rise of capitalism or the rise of the modern state as examples of that. So I guess those are some of the ways I would go, but it's a fairly broad question. Maybe it could be rendered a little more, maybe the skepticism could be made a little bit more precise so that I could figure out what I'm supposed to be responding to.
I think another concern that this person has expressed is one that we hear often, which is are all of the elements of critical realism a package such that if you accept one element, you necessarily have to accept another. And they're in particular concerned with whether accepting a powers account of causation and a strong version of social emergence necessarily entails a rejection of the fact-value distinction. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, as a general argument, I would say that one of the things Bhaskar hit the nail on the head with was that even if we refuse sort of the relativist accounts of theory choice, we have to acknowledge, now that we've had hundreds of years of the history of sciences, that science is always changing and always embedded within contexts as well, and not simply a process of getting ever closer to its truth. That must be true of everything that we do, including critical realism. So the idea that it's a package that one has to accept would fly in the face of every other theoretical program that has ever been developed. And so no, of course it's not a package. And I think there's even been evolution in the last few years over the course of the discussion that we've been having in the critical realism network and the ways certain people have been approaching different questions. As for the values question, I didn't talk about that here because that's more the specialty of people like Phil. But it seems to me that Bhaskar's original formulation, which is that you can do something called criticizing, or you can do an explanatory critique, that by pointing to social structures that systematically produce false knowledge about the world, that automatically yields an ethical program of eliminating that program. I think that has been pretty unsatisfying for many people as if that were all that could be said about the program, and Bhaskar himself elaborated on that further. So there's no sense of it being a static program, and I don't think if we wanted to really get into Bhaskar himself, and I think Tim Ruzzo or someone who's a Bhaskarian would be better able to cover that question, but I don't think his work was static either.
Well, let me just jump in and amplify on 2 points that you made, George, about ways in which I think critical realism has changed just in recent years. So One is a shift from talk about causal mechanisms to causal powers.
That's right.
And this is actually something that we'll be exploring in greater depth at at a conference later on in March. But I do think this is a really quite significant shift, just because it moves us away from the kind of mechanistic and physicalistic and regularistic language or implications of the mechanisms concept itself. And I think a further thing is that if one embraces some version of a critical naturalism, I think that it does imply that one is adapting some limited version of a naturalistic ethics, right? So this is not a kind of imperative ethics, a thou shalt or thou shalt not kind of ethics, but more a kind of prudential ethics of that these are the conditions under which human beings or human communities do well or ill, and that this is in fact not just a sort of a purely relativistic or subjectivistic question. This is a question which, within some limits, is something that we can actually, that has some objective reality that can actually be studied. This doesn't mean that we're going to come up with some kind of a blueprint for a perfect society, but I think that's a sense in which there probably is a sort of a deep and inherent connection between questioning the fact-value distinction and embracing a critical naturalism, right? I do think that those things really do follow on from one another. And we should have Webb Keane come on and talk about this. I think his new book is, I think, just a fantastic attempt to sort of, thread the needle in between relativism and moral relativism and moral universalism. So we'll put that on our to-do list, right? You have to chat Webb up for us.
Yeah. And I think the point you just made would be an interesting one to relate to already existing distinctions in critical realism. For example, we've always distinguished between a sort of a meta theory of what a social science has to do and has to be if it's going to be an acceptable social science, and a substantive set of social theories about the actual causal powers that exist and things like that, so that there's no necessary social theory that's connected to critical realism. And it was important, I think, to make that move because of the early connections between critical realism and Marxism, which isn't necessarily a necessary social theory that necessarily goes hand in hand with critical realism, arguably. And I think the same thing could be said for what you just did, Phil, with ethics and critical realism, that it seems to imply that if there is some kind of set of powers in human beings, that there would stem from that some kind of ethical stance, but it doesn't prejudge the issue of what they are. And I think it goes back to the earlier question of whether this is a package or not. Maybe we need to distinguish between a package of meta claims and a package of substantive claims. And I think the substantive theoretical claims are obviously more open to research.
Couldn't agree more. So I'm going to, here's a nuts and bolts methodological question for you, George, okay, which is about case selection. So if we go back to the old Millian, Scotch-Polian, quasi-experimental account of what historical and comparative explanation consists of, then that gives us a certain rationale for selecting cases. And I think the question is about, well, if we really move away from that to a critical realist approach to historical sociology, then how do we know which cases it would be important or useful to compare, and on what basis do we make those judgments?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that the Millian method did give us guidance for case selection, except in this, if we accepted that we can do only method of difference and agreement, and we should accept only cases in which every variable except one was different and the opposite. But that doesn't seem to be a very good version of case selection, since it maps so poorly onto the empirical world, the real world. But case selection, I think, could be approached in a couple of different ways. I talked about comparisons across causal powers, or depth realist comparison versus actualist comparison. Actualist comparison, to start with that, I think this is where Weber's, going back to Weber's writings on the fact-value distinction, he was on to one thing, which is that there are certain events that are humanly important to us. And these may be humanly important for reasons that you were just talking about, Phil, in terms of a realist ethics, but we don't know that yet. What we do know is that some of the most humanly important events were systematically downplayed as possible objects of analysis in sociology because they didn't fall into, they weren't repeated events, and they didn't seem to be amenable to that. So that's a different approach to case selection than one that seems to be based on a kind of a statistics model of case selection. As for the depth realist case selection, here I think you start from your interest in a certain set of causal powers or a single causal power. Let's say you're interested in Bourdieu's field theory. What you will try to do is think about what kinds of cases that approach suggests you should look at, where you would expect fields to emerge, where you would expect certain features of fields to emerge. For example, you would expect certain kinds of practices to be more autonomous or capable of achieving relative autonomy, and others to be more pulled toward heteronomy, toward dependence on the economy or the state. And you would probably want to systematically do comparative depth analysis, depth realist analysis, looking at field formation in those two different kinds of situations. You look at the field of poetry and the field of architecture, for example. In the field of poetry, you would expect to be able to attain a deep sort of autonomy, precisely because of the low resources, economic resources and political resources required to do poetry. And you'd look at architecture as one that's likely to be pulled into heteronomy. And then you might have other hypotheses about the kinds of social properties that lead toward different patterns of asymmetry or domination and subordination within those fields. So I don't think case selection is a problem. I just think it would work in a completely different way from the way that the Millian model suggested it should work, which always seemed utterly artificial and to have almost nothing to do with how actual historians, or for that matter even human beings, think about how they should study the social world.
All right, so we have a couple of questions about mechanisms. And in particular, how the critical realist approach to causal mechanisms differs from other approaches that are out there, say the kind advocated by analytical sociology or the kind advocated by contentious politics school a la Tilly. Mm-hmm. And then there is also a related question, which is, must mechanisms be unobservable? And if so, why?
Okay, well, I'll start with the first one. No, unobservable is just something that needs to be mentioned because it's permitted for them to be unobservable, not because they have to be unobservable. And that flows directly from the history of science and is pretty clear that in the social sciences, given the unobservability of many of the most powerful causal powers that have been identified in social theory, social class, for example, in social science, have not been observable, but by no means does it need to be unobservable. No, so that's easy. What it is carving out a space for causal powers that may not be immediately palpable, empirically observable, or that may involve abstraction from the empirical, but they may also involve a move toward the empirical. So no, they don't have to be unobservable. On the first question, I think the main distinction there is in terms of this criterion of actualism, that the contentious politics a la Tilly and was a cataloging of things that we would, in critical realism, probably describe as more actual level or empirical level phenomena, or at the very best, at the very least, I guess, didn't make a distinction between those two. And I think that is absolutely how Tilly himself thought about it, because I talked to him about that. He did not accept the critical realist approach, but wanted to adopt a mechanisms language. And it was pretty clear that it was a distinct one from that. And then the analytical sociology, I don't quite understand exactly what's meant by it there, but it seems to me it's also an empirical level phenomenon. But maybe someone who's listening in now can correct me. That's the way I've understood it, as empirical. So a mechanism is what we would call a conjunction of events. It may not be a constant conjunction. It may be a concatenation of conjunctions in an analytical narrative. But I've tried to be pretty explicit that I don't think rational choice theory is empiricist. So to the extent that analytical sociology is combined with rational choice theory, I think it would violate that. I think rational choice theory can be, because it involves an abstract, unobservable, to use that term again, language about a causal mechanism such as rationality, automatically breaks with actualism and empiricism. And to the extent that certain kinds of more complex game theoretical forms of rational choice theory don't involve constant conjunctions of events, it's at that level completely compatible with critical realism. It's just that the limiting of the substantive theory to a theory of rationality is one that I would reject, but I don't think it's incompatible with the meta theory of critical realism.
Yeah, just to sort of respond to that very briefly, I mean, I think it is the case that properly understood rational choice theory does involve theoretical non-observables. Rationality preferences are another good example of this. These are not things that can be directly observed, but that we postulate based on things that we can observe. But I think in some cases, what rational choice theory does, and this is certainly true of analytical sociology, is that it hides behind an empiricist self-justification. Says we're just talking about individuals. Individuals are things that you can actually see, unlike, say, social structures, which you can't. But of course, you can't see a preference any more than you can see a social structure. So I think that there's a way in which a certain construal of rational choice theory could be read in critical realist terms, but that it's incompatible to the degree that it rejects the idea of social structure. Also, just have a sort of a quick thought about the mechanisms versus powers thing. I mean, one idea would actually be to think of mechanisms as one species of power, and in this, here you would think of a mechanism as being like the mechanism inside of a clock. In other words, it's something that's operating, outside of or beyond the normal person's powers of observation, operating behind social actors' backs, if you will. And I think that was, in fact, one of the intents, right, of the mechanisms concept to begin with, and sort of basic critical realism. I mean, it was partly intended as a critical concept. So the idea is, for example, exploitation, classic example, is that, people misconstrue labor relations in terms of wage labor and free contracting, when in fact what's actually going on is the extraction of surplus value. Well, that's a way of using the idea of a causal mechanism in a critical way, as opposed to a purely explanatory way. But of course, there are powers in the social world of which we're perfectly well aware, and of which we have a completely accurate picture. And so mechanism would just be that particular case of a causal power which is operating, behind the backs of actors, and usually is abetted by a systematic misconstrual or misrecognition of what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's excellent, and I think that's obviously key to, as you were pointing out, to Marx and to many other top-notch social theorists like Bourdieu. They begin with that idea moving beyond the level of appearances or spontaneous sociologies and looking at causal things going on behind the backs. The word is burdened by the connotations, but there needs to be some word for that kind of thing. And then there can be powers which are much more visible, so this could go to the non-observable discussion earlier. The third term is structures or social structures. Structures are often observable, are more empirical level. I guess even though I used fields as an exemplification of an unobservable causal mechanism before, there are probably other structures like network structures which are linked to individual people, nodes of people or of institutions, and where those people and institutions are visible. And so we might be able to do something with that.
So another question which has come up is one about how you actually put the notion of emergence and stratification and levels to work in actual research practice. So how do you actually go about distinguishing between different levels of structure? How do you determine which ones are relevant or irrelevant? And I think this is a question you should be able to hit out of the park, since it's definitely one that I know you thought a lot about in The Devil's Handwriting, which you thought a lot about in your recent attempts to theorize transnational, global, and colonial fields.
Well, maybe I could give an example from my work on German colonialism and The Devil's Handwriting. I think that's a good one too, because it may be able to tease out some of the distinctions we were just making. I basically tried to explain, and I started with a actualist comparison between different forms of native colonial policy in different colonies, trying to explain why in some cases the German colonizers engaged in genocide, and in others they engaged in protection, and in others they seemed to move into a kind of a civilizational exchange with the people that they were colonizing. It seemed to require some theoretical work to figure that out, and so I looked into the main theoretical approaches and sort of systematically checked them off. So it didn't seem that the causal mechanisms or causal powers associated with economic theories and Marxism were able to make much sense of these policies. It didn't seem like a geopolitical approach, at least one that stayed at the level of general requirements of geopolitics could explain these variations. So I had to dig down deeper, and then there's a set of mechanisms that are arguably, or causal powers that are arguably more observable, and some that are less observable, and get into the question of emergence. The observable ones have to do with the pre-colonial racial representations of the people that are being colonized, and those are never unobservable. They're always observable texts, even though certain textual practices of analysis allowed me to figure out what the major arguments and tropes of those were and to construct a kind of a field of possible representations. Nonetheless, that exists at the level of the empirically evident. The other two, though, I think that the other two causes that I ended up using to explain that and found to be the most powerful were less immediately observable. The first one I've already mentioned, which is the concept of social field. And by constructing the colonial state as a social field, I was able to make sense of certain historical shifts in policy that wouldn't otherwise have been rational, have been explicable. For example, the shift toward a politics of genocide in German Southwest Africa involved a shifting in the field of power, or the field of the colonial state within German Southwest Africa, sort of the local colonial field. And to understand the moves that the different people made, I had to reconstruct their social properties and the transformations they typically underwent within the overseas colonial sphere, so that aristocracies, university-educated Sanskritists and Orientalists and people like that, and bourgeois investors all invested the colonial state with a certain set of social properties, but those underwent certain systematic transformations as a result of that field. So that's something that's not immediately empirically evident and involved kind of an abstraction from reality. But the one that is the third, which is the most obviously linked to a non-observable causal mechanism or power. Really a mechanism, to use Phil's way of talking about that earlier, is the idea of the unconscious identifications of colonizers with the people they're colonizing. And in certain cases, I think I was able to show that certain changes in colonial policy and actions on the part of colonizing officials could only be explained in terms of these unconscious identifications, even though, of course, I don't have any empirical evidence of that because these are dead people who didn't have psychoanalysts at the time who wrote down what they were thinking. There's a kind of a retroductive logic through which the actions seem only to make sense in terms of a model of identification and of fantasy projection, fantasy formation and projection. And so I think in a way that's an interesting way of thinking about those three causal mechanisms, the one that has to do with discourse or representation, the one that has to do with social fields, and the one that has to do with unconscious representations and fantasies and projections, in that they go deeper and deeper into levels of in terms of unobservable causal powers. Now, so that's the answer, I guess.
Okay, so I have one last question for you, George, and this is a question I think about the degree of abstraction that is involved in generating real types. So in our earlier discussion of real types, you mentioned, for example, the social field, the unconscious, for instance. And I guess the question is, are there more? Are these just sort of general instances, and there are more specific types, or is this, or should we rather think about there being types of lower generality or lower scale? I don't know. I guess it's really a question about whether real types have to be at that kind of scale and generality, or whether there could also be real types that would be operating, only in a specific context, or which would be operating, say, in small group dynamics or something like that.
Well, first of all, I think you could, if the concept of real type makes sense, it could be applied to all of those things. And secondly, I think it could be a concept that's used to make sense of empirical phenomena like the state, or even a given event like the French Revolution, as well as causal powers, of which, say, the unconscious is an example, or field, and causal structures or causal powers. And both of those, I think, the real type approach suggests that we should, instead of one-sidedly accentuating certain aspects of them that are currently of interest to us, we should try to understand how these things are working. And with the example of field and unconscious, those show also how it's not just our own individual conception of how they're working, but there's a whole body of other research which has been working away at these concepts for quite a long time and giving more and more evidence about how these should be thought of and whether there's evidence for certain ways of thinking about them or not. I mentioned earlier the unconscious. I mean, we had to wait more than a century for neurological cognitive psychologists to show that there actually were, they don't unconscious social thinking processes. They haven't definitely argued that they work the same way that psychoanalysis argues, but at least, at the very least, it was a safe thing to do, to talk about things that couldn't be seen and for which we only had event-level evidence to go on. And with fields, I think it's a similar thing. I mean, what value, what realistic value does field have as opposed to, say, a concept like network or institution? Well, it seems to explain empirical level events, but there needs to be this constant dialectical moving back and forth between the concept of field and these events that we're trying to explain and the evidence about them. So I think real type is more of an orientating procedure, again, going back to the idea of thinking about a meta-theory, and it's a meta-theoretical set of assumptions, not a theoretical set of claims about specific objects.
All right, George. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time here, and you've really fielded an awful lot of questions. So thanks an awful lot again for pulling together this great presentation for us today. We've had a couple of folks ask about how they might access webinar recordings, and if you're looking at your screen, you'll see some more information about that. I think the sticking point may be that you have to go in and register again in order to access the recordings. But Tim Rutzow here, who wears many hats for us, amongst others, IT specialist extraordinaire, assures me that the recordings are up and available for those who would like to listen to them. So please do give them a listen if you're interested. And last note is I'd just like to encourage any of you who are out there who are interested to consider applying for one of the working groups for young scholars that we've been advertising. You'll also find information about those on the Critical Realism Network website. So thanks again for tuning in, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to have Webkeen and others on here soon.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Goodbye. It was a great conversation.